So it shouldn't surprise most of you to hear that SeaWorld has been struggling a lot in the recent years. Ever since the Blackfish documentary came out in 2013, attendance has been pretty low for SeaWorld and its other parks that it owns, including Busch Gardens. Because of this, there have been many rumors and speculations that maybe SeaWorld will be looking to sell some of their parks. Although it does seem like SeaWorld and its other parks have been steadily regaining some attendance, it still is a very likely possibility they may look to sell off some of their parks in favor of gaining some capital. That all being said, who could even buy any of the SeaWorld parks? Let's meet the contenders. Our first potential buyer is Disney Parks, and let me just say, they're pretty unlikely right off the bat to buy any of the SeaWorld or Busch Gardens parks, just because they would need to pretty much change almost everything about the parks in order to make them a Disney park, because obviously SeaWorld and Busch Gardens don't necessarily lend themselves very well to becoming Disney parks right off the bat. On top of this, SeaWorld and Busch Gardens locations aren't super appealing to Disney. Walt Disney World in Orlando has a ton of land that they aren't even using right now that they are going to use for future expansions. So they definitely do not need the land or the parks from SeaWorld Orlando or Busch Gardens Tampa. As for Busch Gardens Williamsburg and SeaWorld San Antonio, I don't really see them acquiring those parks either, because at this point I don't really see them expanding anywhere outside of the major tourist destinations like Orlando and Anaheim, where they already are located. As for SeaWorld San Diego, they may look to possibly acquire this land if they can acquire land to expand the Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, because as many of you already probably know, they don't have a whole lot of space there at the Disneyland Resort. So if worse comes to worse, they may want to look into buying that, but that is about an hour and 20-minute drive away, so I don't see them making that investment. So as of right now, Disney isn't really looking to buy. Our next contender is Universal Studios, who was heavily rumored for many years to potentially be buying SeaWorld's Orlando location. However, with the recent acquisition of a ton of land just about 2 miles away from where the rest of Universal Orlando Resort is, Universal is in no need of the land that SeaWorld Orlando would provide them, so they're out for the parks in Florida. Similar to Disney, I do not see them expanding to Williamsburg or San Antonio, as they really only seem interested in being into the major tourist destinations. And finally, as for the SeaWorld San Diego location, it's really just way too far away from where Universal Studios Hollywood is located in Los Angeles for them to want to try and acquire that land, even though they are desperate for land at that location. So for right now, Universal is out. Our next contender is Cedar Fair, owner of all the parks you currently see on the screen, except for, of course, SeaWorld and Busch Gardens parks. Starting with SeaWorld Orlando and Busch Gardens Tampa, I don't necessarily see Cedar Fair expanding down there, just simply because they don't want to compete in the already super competitive theme park market already existent in Orlando. Because if you haven't already noticed, they like to be in locations where there aren't necessarily a whole lot of other theme parks existent. They like to appeal to the local crowd, not necessarily tourists, so Florida wouldn't necessarily be a good option for them. Busch Gardens Williamsburg and SeaWorld San Antonio, on the other hand, I think are very attractive locations for them, because they have nothing even close to where SeaWorld San Antonio is right now, and Texas is a very big state with a lot of people living there. And I think that would be a really great location for them to kind of bring in a lot of locals to try and obtain some of that market. And as for Busch Gardens Williamsburg, they already have a park in Virginia about an hour away or so from Busch Gardens, and that's King's Dominion. However, those are the only two major theme parks in Virginia. So if they were to acquire Busch Gardens, not only could they potentially sell King's Dominion and whatever the new park would be, or if they kept it Busch Gardens, whatever, they could potentially sell them together as a package, so they could bring in some tourists, and they would pretty much have a stranglehold over the entire Virginia theme park market. So that's not a terrible investment. And finally, as for SeaWorld San Diego, It's a bit too far away from Knott's for it to be sold as a package like Kings Dominion and Busch Gardens Williamsburg could be, but it's also close enough where it would potentially directly compete. So it doesn't really make sense. They would kind of end up competing with themselves there, especially considering that they are in the tourist market there, which I don't really necessarily think they even like being in the first place. So that one's out. The final point that's pretty major to Cedar Fair potentially not buying any of these parks is that they have very little to no experience with working with animals at all. And since that's a major part of the Busch Gardens and SeaWorld parks, it's going to be kind of tough for them to start to manage those parks if they were to acquire them. And to be honest, I don't really see them looking to make a huge investment in trying to get rid of the animals, as it just really wouldn't necessarily be worth it at that point. So for right now, Cedar Fair, they're definitely a contender, but they are a bit of a toss-up right now as to whether or not they could really be in the market for buying the SeaWorld and Busch Gardens parks. Our final contender is Six Flags. Now, unlike Cedar Fair, they actually do have quite a bit of experience with working with animals at a lot of their parks. So acquiring Busch Gardens or SeaWorld and keeping that aspect of the park is certainly not out of the question. As for the locations, starting with the Florida parks, I actually think that the Florida locations are very appealing to Six Flags because they can appeal to the local market down there like they have been in all their other parks like Cedar Fair does, but they can also attract a bit of tourists who are maybe looking to spend another day at a cheaper theme park as opposed to another day at Disney or another day at Universal. That being said, they probably do not want to buy the SeaWorld Orlando location because that is right in the tourist area in Orlando. The Tampa location would leave them a bit detached from that so they can still more easily market themselves to the locals of the area as opposed to tourists. As for the SeaWorld San Antonio location, it gets a little bit interesting here because Six Flags already has a San Antonio park, and that's Fiesta, Texas. So they could acquire SeaWorld San Antonio and then package the two together as kind of a 2-day trip type deal. However, like I mentioned before, they like to appeal to locals, not necessarily tourists. So they would have to shift their marketing for the San Antonio locations to become tourist destinations as opposed to being a place for the locals, which I'm not really sure if they're really looking to do. It's already a big investment to bring in a new park, but now you have to shift your marketing focus from appealing to locals to now appealing to tourists, which I'm not really sure if they're willing to do. But if they're willing to make the jump to that, then SeaWorld San Antonio is definitely a very attractive location. As for SeaWorld San Diego, similarly to Knott's Berry Farm and Cedar Fair, it's a bit too far away from Magic Mountain, which is in Los Angeles, and they already have 2 California parks. They much rather acquire parks that are in markets where they can appeal to the locals and don't have to compete with many other parks. The final option is Busch Gardens Williamsburg, which is another interesting one because they have a lot of parks to the north of it, as you can see, in Maryland, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. So it's a bit close to other parks, which isn't great, but it still is in a pretty solid location and a somewhat decent tourist location in Williamsburg. And it also gets a good amount of locals from the Virginia crowd. However, one, you're competing directly with Cedar Fair and Kings Dominion, which Busch Gardens already has to deal with. And two, unlike every other Six Flags park, the Busch Gardens parks have a crazy amount of theming, which if Six Flags were to turn the Busch Gardens parks into Six Flags parks, they would stick out like a sore thumb because they have a ton of theming, but no other Six Flags park does. Of course, they could keep the name the same. They could keep it Busch Gardens, but if they don't buy both parks, which I don't necessarily see them doing, they can't keep the name. And I certainly don't see them spending the money to untheme the park to try and make it more like Six Flags parks. So I don't really know if Busch Gardens parks are really a great investment. I think they are more likely to be the investment from Six Flags opposed to the SeaWorld parks just because they have a lot of coasters, which Six Flags very much so likes. So for right now, Six Flags is a maybe. Now, although those are the major contenders from within the theme park industry, it's very possible that we could see some outside investors possibly buy the company, possibly other theme park companies, maybe even from Europe that maybe want to expand their brand to the US. All that stuff, there's many different people and companies that could acquire them, but really these are the major ones from within the theme park industry. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Who do you think is going to buy them? Do you think that SeaWorld will even sell any of its parks? Leave it down in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.